Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. A black housekeeper hid her fighter pilot status for 8 years, until she was forced into the cockpit. For 8 long years, Nora Fields, a black woman in her 40s, had been silently pacing the halls of an Air Force base in Louisiana, armed not with a flight helmet but with a bucket and a broom. Every morning, before the sun had even pierced the warm mists of the bayou, she donned the dark blue maintenance uniform, as sleek and pristine as the fuselage of a well-maintained jet. Discreet. Reserved. Meticulous. That's how her colleagues described her. But deep down, no one really knew her. Her eyes, dark and deep, bore the traces of a dense past, filled with memories she had learned to keep silent. She spoke only when necessary. Hello, sorry, I'll clean up here later, were enough to fill her days. When she passed, some of the young pilots barely raised their heads. A few greeted her politely, automatically, without really giving her a sincere look. The majority didn't even see it. To them, she was part of the base's functional decor, like a trespassing sign or a fire extinguisher. A familiar but invisible silhouette. They didn't know that this modest woman, sometimes bent over with fatigue, had once soared through the skies to the thunderous roar of an F-22 Raptor. They didn't know that her hands, now rough from scrubbing the ground, had once caressed the controls of a supersonic fighter jet at over Mach 2. Yet in her movements, there remained an instinctive military rigor, her steady step, her precise gestures, the way she meticulously aligned the cleaning products on her trolley, as one might arrange instruments in a cockpit. A rigor that few noticed, or understood. Even the base commander, Colonel Jeff Rayner, a stern man with graying temples, knew nothing about her. To him, she was just another employee, reliable and silent. Always punctual. Never a complaint. Never late. Always available to work overtime when the base received foreign visitors. A discreet pearl, he once said without much thought to a logistics officer. He had never questioned why such an efficient woman had accepted such a modest position, nor the furtive glance she sometimes cast towards the runways when the F-22s took off with a deafening roar. That look wasn't that of a simple employee fascinated by airplanes. It was the look of a pilot deprived of her wings. But no one took the time to see him. And perhaps that was what Nora was looking for. To be forgotten. To dissolve into anonymity. To survive without making a noise. What no one knew was that in her time, she had been codenamed Shadow. Today, the nickname was almost prophetic. She was nothing more than a shadow among the shadows of this base, a former legend silenced. 10 years ago, Nora Fields wasn't just another maintenance worker you passed by without a word. She wore her flight uniform with pride, emblazoned on her chest with the silver wings of a fighter pilot. In the halls of the Air Force, she was known by her radio call sign, Captain Nora Shadow Fields. Shadow, because she appeared silently, struck with precision, and disappeared without a trace. She was one of the first black women to conquer the cockpit of the F-22 Raptor, the most advanced fighter jet of its generation. It wasn't a privilege, it was a victory earned through sleepless nights, relentless training, and missions where mistakes were not permitted. In a male-dominated field, often hostile to diversity, she had established herself not by favor, but by excellence. Her record in simulation was impressive. No pilot liked being singled out against her during exercises, because she beat them, methodically, without cruelty, but without compromise. Her reflexes were sharp, her tactical analysis feared. She read radar like others read music. And then everything fell apart. It was at an annual military gala, in a hall lit by glitzy chandeliers, that her destiny changed. That evening, she wore a simple dress, a rare break from her uniform. She was talking with a few colleagues when a man approached, General Conrad Halberd, decorated, respected, and feared. He approached her with the predatory smile of those who confuse power with rights. His words were disguised as compliments, but his intentions were clear. "A woman like you shouldn't be left alone tonight." Nora pushed him away firmly, but calmly. She didn't shout. She didn't try to humiliate him. She simply set a clear boundary. But some powerful men experience refusals as declarations of war. The very next day, the first rumors began to circulate, insinuations about his attitude, doubts cast on his mission reports. A month later, an internal investigation was opened into him. They looked for the flaw. And they found it, an administrative form, incorrectly signed, dating back 2 years. A minor error that hundreds of officers made every year without consequence. But in his case, it was the perfect excuse. Temporary suspension for reassessment of his duties. That was the verdict. No hearing. No lawyer. No chance to defend himself. Her unit was disbanded. Her assignments were withdrawn. And silence fell upon those who had once hailed her with pride. A few colleagues murmured their support privately, but no one dared to stand up to General Halberd. He was too powerful. Too dangerous. Nora, for her part, found herself isolated, broken, erased from the system she had served with loyalty. And because she no longer had any network, any income, or any chance of being reinstated, she did what she had sworn never to do, accept a civilian job, far from cockpits and tactical maps. Ironically, the available position happened to be at the very same base where she had led squadrons, given combat briefings, and conducted squadron leader simulations. Now she was mopping where once she had plotted approaches. Every corner of the base reminded her of what she had been. Every jet engine that roared in the sky echoed like a ghost of her former life. But Nora wasn't crying. She was taking it all in. Silently. With dignity. She was waiting. Maybe for a sign. Maybe one day. On a hot and humid morning, the military airbase bustles like a beehive. Foreign flags fluttered alongside the Star-Spangled Banner. A delegation of senior European and Asian military officials had landed a few hours earlier to observe a joint exercise demonstrating the capabilities of America's elite air force. The program included a complex tactical flight with the F-22 Raptor, the flagship of U.S. air superiority. A demonstration designed to impress allies and assert the U.S. Air Force's strategic dominance. But just 2 hours before takeoff, a health emergency cast a shadow over preparations. The 2 pilots scheduled for the demonstration, recently returned from a deployment in West Africa, were placed in precautionary quarantine after an alert of possible biological exposure. The protocol was strict. No flights were authorized. Colonel Jeff Rayner, pale, paced nervously around the hangar, shouting orders into his walkie-talkie, calling for replacements, but all the qualified pilots were either on a mission or too young to take the risk in front of foreign generals. A tense silence reigned. Millions of dollars, a reputation, and strategic agreements depended on this demonstration. Canceling it would be a diplomatic affront. It was at this moment that a low voice, almost cut off by the distant roar of an airplane, rose up. An old mechanic, Hank Delroy, a former non-commissioned officer and discreet friend of Nora, leaned toward the colonel. "Colonel, there's someone here who can fly that Raptor better than any of your men." The colonel raised an eyebrow in annoyance. "Who?" "Nora Fields." A burst of contemptuous laughter burst from Rayner's mouth. "Are you talking about the cleaning lady? The one who mops the floors in the pilot's locker room?" But Hank didn't laugh. He held her gaze, straight. "I'm talking about Captain Nora Shadow Fields. 164 missions, 1,280 flight hours, Silver Star, former commander of Viper 5 Squadron." The colonel stopped smiling. He stared at the mechanic, as if his words came from another world. A few minutes later, Nora was rushed to the shed. She arrived still dressed in her work clothes, broom in hand, a stain of detergent on her sleeve. All around her, eyes turned. Mocking from some, intrigued from others. The colonel, arms crossed, appraised her for a long time, unable to believe that such a simple, invisible, woman could one day have been so close to the clouds on a combat mission. "You were really a pilot, Fields?" His voice was thick with skepticism, almost disdain. Nora looked him straight in the eyes. Without trembling. Yes, sir. F-22 Raptor. 164 missions. 1,280 flight hours. Silver Star for Operation Black Sky. Trained at Nellis. 2 years as an instructor at Langley. Number 3 in National Mock Combat. A deafening silence fell over the hangar. The colonel gritted his teeth. He no longer had the luxury of doubt. Time was running out. The delegations were waiting, the radars were ready, and the world was watching. "Prepare it," he said curtly. A young officer escorted her to the locker room. She slowly put on a brand new flight suit, like a rediscovered heirloom, then tucked her helmet under her arm. As she entered the cockpit, her fingers brushed over each control like a sacred instrument. She closed her eyes for a moment. 10 years of silence. 10 years of betrayal. 10 years of grief. And yet, it was all still there. The Raptor's engine roared. The air vibrated. On the ground, the technicians had fallen silent. The foreign generals, gathered in the control tower, watched without knowing who the pilot was. The radar screen lit up. Then, the sky opened. Nora displayed all her art. Vertical rise at 60 degrees. Low-altitude passage and inverted flight close to the tower. Evasive post-combustion maneuvers. Tight hairpin turns. Combat simulation with virtual targeting and ultra-precise dodging. In the control tower, the international officers stood up in disbelief, fascinated by the fluidity of the maneuvers. "Who is this pilot?" asked a Japanese general. "He's a demon in the air," murmured a German observer. As she returned to the track, the engine noise slowly faded, replaced by an almost religious silence. Nora slowly lifted the visor of her helmet, revealing a face marked by effort, determination, but also a kind of liberation. Around her, the entire ground crew held their breath. Their eyes were fixed on her, stunned and incredulous. Some pilots, who had previously ignored or scorned her, now stared at her with a mixture of admiration and astonishment. A young pilot, still pale, stepped forward timidly, his eyes shining with new understanding. "Who are you really?" he asked, his voice trembling. Nora, head held high, simply replied. "Just someone we tried to silence." These words echoed like a clap of thunder in the hot air of the base. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire throughout the military base. Whispers turned into heated conversations. Colleagues, former comrades of Nora, began to emerge from the shadows. Forgotten documents were unearthed from the dusty archives, revealing her record, her accolades, but also the obscure reasons for her exclusion. Official military networks, and soon social media, amplified the news. Forums dedicated to veterans, pilots, and civil rights advocates seized on his story. Witnesses who had previously remained silent began to speak out, flight companions, instructors, and mechanics, all confirming Nora's story. They recounted the admiration she inspired, but also the injustice she had suffered. Under mounting pressure, military authorities opened a formal investigation into the actions of the general responsible for his ouster. Accusations of racial discrimination, sexual harassment, and abuse of power were brought to light. Faced with the evidence, the general was withdrawn and then prosecuted before a military court for his actions. The Pentagon, in a solemn statement broadcast on national television, issued a public apology to Nora Fields, recognizing the seriousness of the errors committed and saluting her courage and dedication. This gesture, although late, was a major victory not only for Nora, but for all those who, in the shadows, had been victims of prejudice and injustice. In the days that followed, Nora was invited to testify before Congress on issues of discrimination in the military. Her once silenced voice became a powerful force for change. The media dubbed her the shadow that rose, and her story inspired reforms aimed at ensuring a more equitable and inclusive military environment. But for Nora, beyond the spotlight, there was above all the deep satisfaction of having rediscovered her truth and of having, finally, made her own flight heard. A few months later, after an intense wave of public support, political pressure, and an internal review of closed files, Nora Fields was officially reinstated. But not simply to give back what had been unjustly taken from her. No. This time, she came back even higher. In a symbolic and strategic gesture, the Defense Department offered her a position of rare stature, National Director of Fighter Pilot Training. A prestigious position, occupying an office in the Pentagon but operating primarily on the ground, at all the country's major air bases. She now had authority over several squadrons, oversaw the training of hundreds of recruits, and led reforms to elite programs. His voice had become central to the Air Force's strategic decisions. His experience, his silence transformed into speech, had become a force that no one could ignore. In her first address to the young graduates of the Colorado Springs Academy, she paused, looked at the crowd with an eye that was both gentle and determined, and said, "I had to keep silent for 8 years. They took away my wings, my name, my voice. But today, I speak for all those who were erased. I no longer fly just for myself. I fly for them." These words were echoed in the world's media. Posters, quotes, and graduation speeches made them a symbol. A new page in military history was being written, and Nora was its pen. In tribute to her courage, perseverance, and resilience, the base where she had been a housekeeper, the same base where she had once been erased, decided to rename its Air Training Center. Today, a bronze plaque shines at the entrance to the Captain Nora Fields Air Training Center, which reads, "Here, the shadow has become light." On the tarmac, under the blazing Louisiana sun, young recruits sometimes come across an elegant, upright figure, helmet under arm, gold-reflecting glasses, walking with the ease that only those who have defied gravity possess. She doesn't talk much. She observes, corrects, and sometimes smiles. But in his gaze, there is the sky. A living legend. A survivor. A general of souls. Because Nora Fields never stopped believing in the power of altitude. Even when the world wanted to nail her to the ground.